Alright, there's not much going on in the world of entertainment right now. In fact, most everyone is focused on the political election right now. And while that is all well and good at keeping us busy, I still need stuff to make videos on. Yeah, I have been watching The Mandalorian Season 2. That first episode was super awesome, new episode premieres tonight, and I was thinking about doing videos about each episode, but I think I'm gonna save that for WandaVision. So I'll do a video on the season when it wraps up. Besides, I did say I should make videos on the Dark Knight Trilogy, so let's get this started. It's time for Andy Tolsky to take on the Dark Knight Trilogy. Batman Begins. So Batman Begins came out in June of 2005, so about 15 and a half years ago. Feel old yet? I was 10 years old at the time. I'll be honest, I actually did not see this movie in theaters. I was too young, I probably wouldn't have understood most of it. This reinvigoration of the Batman franchise was directed by Christopher Nolan, and it certainly was a reimagining of Batman, cinematically speaking anyway. Since before this movie, the Batman movies were, Batman, Batman Returns, Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, they were more child-friendly, I guess. What I mean to say is that they were nothing like this trilogy. What Christopher Nolan did with Batman in this trilogy is he pretty much made the most realistic superhero movies I've ever seen. In fact, I don't even like calling these movies superhero movies, since to me that kind of undercuts them. If you ask me, these three movies are the best movies to ever come out of DC, and I think a lot of people would agree. And it all started right here in 2005 with Batman Begins. This movie really sits you down and tells you the origin story of the Batman. Bruce Wayne in this trilogy is played by Christian Bale, and if you've been subscribed to me for a while, then you already know that he is my favorite cinematic Batman. And it's not just because he's the one I grew up with, but also, his acting is really good. By now we all know the origin story of the Batman. Bruce Wayne was a kid in Gotham City, born into the extremely wealthy Wayne family. His parents, Thomas and Martha, are murdered right in front of him in cold blood, and this sends him down a long path. Seriously, he spends the next probably 10, 15, 20 years abroad. The movie never says where he goes, but he's living amongst criminals. He's trying to figure out the criminal mindset, why they do what they do. And eventually he comes across a man named Ducard, played by Liam Neeson. Yeah, really good cast in this movie, and the entire trilogy. Ducard invites Bruce Wayne to study with the League of Shadows under the mentorship of Ra's al Ghul. And this is a really big part of the movie, probably my favorite part of the movie, is when Bruce Wayne is training with Ducard in the League of Shadows. He studies how to be a ninja and fight with swords and theatricality and deception, because not only does he learn how to fight, but he learns what will eventually become his mindset and psyche when he does become the Batman later on. And I love that. I love that this movie really sits you down and explains Batman's mindset. No other superhero movie does it like this. The Batman is one of my favorite superheroes of all time, and this trilogy really explains why in the best way possible. And one of my favorite things about the Batman is that he does not kill people. That is his one rule. He will not kill another human being, no matter what. One of my favorite scenes in the movie is, where Ducard hands him the sword. He's like, all right, here's your final test. Execute this man. And Bruce Wayne explains, no, I'm no executioner. And Ducard's like, your compassion is a weakness your enemies will not share. And Bruce Wayne says, that's why it's so important. That's what separates us from them. This criminal should be tried. And I love that. Because that is absolutely true. Morally, ethically, if you murder the bad guys, then you are no better than them. If you kill a killer, the number of killers in the world remains the same. That's the best, isn't it? That's why the Batman is so great. So after Bruce Wayne gets out of there, he leaves the League of Shadows, he goes back to Gotham City, and now we meet the rest of our characters. First off, Michael Caine as Alfred J. Pennyworth, Bruce Wayne's butler and trusted advisor and confidant, the closest friend he has. Michael Caine is the best Alfred ever, because his dialogue, holy shit, his dialogue, all the advice that he gives Bruce Wayne is it's so true. Alfred really is the father figure to Bruce Wayne, and that is another strong point to this movie. Then we have Katie Holmes as Rachel Dawes, who is actually a character that was invented for this trilogy. I don't think she ever existed in the comics before this, and Batman has been around since the 1940s. She's kind of the love interest with Bruce Wayne, but you can tell Christopher Nolan was like, well, she shouldn't just be the love interest, she should actually be an important character in the story. She needs a point and purpose other than just to be the love interest and someone to save later on. So she's a lawyer in Gotham who works in the district attorney's office, and she does end up being pretty important to the story. Then you have Morgan Freeman as Lucius Fox. He's the head of the Wayne Enterprises R&D department. That's research and development, for those of you who don't know what R&D means. He's the guy who pretty much provides all the weapons for Bruce Wayne for when he becomes the Batman. He provides him with the suit, the weapons, the Batpod, which, yeah, in this trilogy, it's never called the Batmobile. They call it the Batpod, and they actually give an explanation as to why it exists. Again, everything is made so realistic in this trilogy, everything requires an explanation, and a good realistic one at that. And if it's not entirely realistic, at least the movie gives it an explanation, And so now Bruce Wayne is back in Gotham City, and finally, an hour into the movie, we have our first Batman scene. And when Batman throws down in this movie, dude, it is awesome. The action in this movie, they're not my favorite action scenes in the entire trilogy, nor is the bat suit in this movie my favorite in the trilogy, but you can't deny the dude certainly has a presence. His first big action scene in this movie, an hour in, he's lurking around the shadows, he's yanking criminals away. There's that classic part where the criminal's freaking out, he's like, "Where are you?" And then Batman shows up right behind him, he's upside down, he's like, "Here." That's awesome. And the scene ends with Carmine Falcone freaking out, he's like, "What the hell are you?" Batman pulls him up through the car sunroof, he's like, "I'm Batman." Dude, come on. That is awesomely, classically awesome. One other thing I love that this movie explains is why bats? I've seen a lot of Batman media, TV shows, cartoons, video games, and of course I've seen my fair share of Batman movies. But I haven't seen anything else explain why Batman uses the symbol of the bat. Why does he dress up like a bat specifically? It's because when he was a kid, he was scared to death by a swarm of bats in a cave, which makes sense. Yeah, he was traumatized. So I love the scene where Alfred asks him why bats, and Bruce Wayne's response, "Bats frighten me. It's time my enemies shared my dread." I love that. So many good lines in this movie, dude. And then we have Gary Oldman in this movie as Jim Gordon, who is known in most Batman lore for being the GCPD police commissioner. But in this movie, he's not quite there at that rank yet. He's a police sergeant in this movie. And he's not in this movie that much, so I'm just gonna breeze over him. He does a good job in the role, but really that comes through in the next two movies. And finally, we have Killian Murphy as Jonathan Crane, aka the Scarecrow. Now, the Scarecrow has always been one of my favorite Batman villains. In most Batman lore, he's known as the master of fear. You know, he sprays people with his fear gas and makes them see their worst fears come to life. You wanna know what I mean? Play Batman Arkham Knight. But Scarecrow in this movie is also really good. And again, I love that this movie explains his mindset as well, why he does what he does. He's a psychiatrist at Arkham Asylum, and there's a line where he says, "I respect the mind's power over the body. That's why I do what I do." You can tell there's just something off about this guy. The unfortunate thing is that, yeah, he's not in the movie that much. I wouldn't call the Scarecrow the main villain in this movie. I mean, I like that he was utilized in this movie because a big theme of the whole movie is confronting your fear. Bruce Wayne confronting his fear of bats and using it against his opponents. So when you're talking about fear in a Batman story, then it just makes sense to bring in the Scarecrow, who is a villain that is literally based on fear. He's just not the kind of villain in a movie that steals the entire show, you know? We'll get there in the next movie. But he does do a good job at playing his part. He does it well. And of course, I cannot talk about the Dark Knight trilogy without talking about the scores of these movies, starting with the first one. It was composed by music maestros Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard, two brilliant film composers. And the musical themes they introduce in this trilogy, starting here in Batman Begins, they're unforgettable. What I love is that the main theme of Batman is just, it's two notes. It's two notes, and it's just great. Bum, bum. That's all you need, because there's so much you can do with just those two notes. But of course, it's not just that, you know? There are a lot of other musical themes in this movie that recur throughout. Bum, 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 bum. It's fantastic music. I have the soundtrack. I have all three soundtracks because they're just worth having. So in the end, Batman Begins is a fantastic start to one of the best superhero trilogies out there. Batman Begins is my least favorite of the three. Hey, someone's got to take the bottom slot. Doesn't mean it's not awesome. Like I said, the movies of the Dark Knight trilogy are probably the most realistic superhero movies we've ever gotten. That's what happens when you hire Christopher Nolan to direct. This movie really set the stage for all the awesome superhero movies to come. So Batman Begins. Have you seen it? What do you think about it? And how does it compare to all the other Batman movies for you? Whatever you think, go ahead and leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe.